Well, rents are rising across Saskatchewan. In fact, the average rent rose 21.4% between May of 2023 and May of 2024. And some experts say the reason? An increase in financialized landlords.
Since March 2022, my rent has gone up $395, or ballpark 40%.
So today on Blue Sky, we're looking at how large corporate ownership of rental units is changing the landscape. And then in the second half of the show, we'll hear about the solutions being put forward in this province to get high rents under control.
There are years where guidelines may not be necessary if the vacancy rates are very healthy. You know, maybe you do let the market do its thing. But right now, with the vacancy rates where they are, there needs to be some balance restored. And I don't think there's a landlord in Saskatchewan that will tell you with a straight face that a 1% vacancy rate is a healthy vacancy rate.
And so we'll find out more about how the NDP's plan for rent guidelines is going over with Saskatchewan landlords. Have you been affected by rising rents? What do you think needs to happen to get rent under control? You can call us today at 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. More than 500,000 affordable housing units disappeared in Canada in a decade. That is data from 2011 to 2021. It's the most recent data that we have. So where did they go? That is a question our guest has been trying to get a handle on for some time now. Martine August is with the University of Waterloo, and her research looks into the rise of financialized landlords. I caught up with her earlier and started by asking, how did we lose a staggering 550,000 affordable units across the country?
Yeah, well, the units are still there. They're just no longer affordable. So what this means is that the prices in those units have gone up so that they're no longer accessible to a lot of average households and lower income households. So we've lost affordable housing as prices on average go up.
And are we talking right across the country? I'm wondering, I think we know how expensive things are in places in British Columbia and in Ontario. When you say rental units are no longer affordable, what's the price tag that tells you it's no longer affordable? What would be a range that you would give?
Yeah, typically in the field, people talk about not spending more than 30% of your household income towards your rent. And so if you can look at what average rents are, you can get a sense of what 30% of that would be, and then compare that to what available rent levels are in different communities, neighborhoods, and across the country. And what we can see is that there is an affordable housing crisis that's been growing as prices of housing rise out of step with people's incomes and ability to afford that housing.
So what's happened? What's caused this?
There's lots of factors. I mean, the one that I'm here to talk about today is this financialization of rental housing. And what that means is that we're seeing a growing portion of housing being bought up by large financial firms. And by financial firms, I'm talking about companies like private equity funds, real estate investment trusts, or REITs for short, big institutional investors like insurance companies and pension funds, also just publicly listed companies. And so these are all financial firms that basically buy up housing, rental housing, and are turning it into an investment product for investors that put money into those companies and then can each month access a portion of the monthly rents that people pay. And so this is a process which matters to us because what we're seeing is financial firms are really motivated to drive value for their shareholders, often in quite an aggressive way. And so that trickles down to affect tenants because the money, the revenues that they generate in rental housing come from the pockets of tenants.
How different is this, a financialized landlord versus, I think, in Saskatchewan, we were under the impression that we had larger companies that were managing a whole lot of rental units. What's the difference between a large corporation running rental units and what you're describing as a financialized landlord?
Yeah, sometimes the difference is not much. You do often see similar behavior among landlords and among large corporate landlords and financial firms. In fact, a lot of financial firms in Canada have evolved from being smaller landlords or other types of corporate landlords. The big difference here is that the housing is turned into an investment product. And so then there's this external compulsion, if you can imagine that, on the managers of that housing, the managers of the financial firms, to meet these expectations of their investors. They may have certain targets they have to hit, certain share value, otherwise they're going to be in trouble. And so there is a more aggressive pursuit of a certain level of profits and growth because this housing is being treated as a financial asset, essentially. And so we're just seeing a more aggressive behavior, I think, in terms of trying to pursue profits from these financial firms. And I mean, your question is a good one. I've been asking this in my research for a while and trying to see, are there actually differences in behavior between large corporate landlords and between these financial firms? And I have found, yeah, there happens to be. I mean, we can show this in terms of evictions. We've looked at eviction filing rates in the city of Toronto and found that financial firms are much more aggressive in filing for evictions. They tend to file 3 times more evictions than other types of landlords in the city. And we've looked at 10 years of data to come up with that. When a building is sold to a financial firm, we tend to see the eviction filing rate go up, and it goes up more if they're buying from a kind of small scale landlord. So there's a real change in behavior. We've also found that rents tend to be higher among financial firms, and that's correcting for the kind of size of the building and the neighborhood. So it's not just that they happen to be in neighborhoods that have higher rents or in new buildings, but that they are charging more and raising rents more each month than other types of companies.
Is this happening in Saskatchewan? My colleague Liam O'Connor has been looking into this, and our understanding so far is yes, we do have financialized landlords in Saskatchewan. But do you have any sense of what this looks like in the different regions and how this might be affecting renters in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, well, I'm sure your colleague has done more recent research and really detailed work, especially having on-the-ground knowledge of Saskatchewan. What I did look at nationwide trends in this when I did research around 2017. And one of the things I found even back then, that Saskatchewan did stand out in terms of having a higher proportion of ownership by REITs, real estate investment trusts, than you would expect, given the province's share of rental housing in Canada. So why did they have more? What I suggested in my research was that it's because of the very weak rent control regime in Saskatchewan. So just to show a comparison, if you look at Saskatchewan next to Manitoba, just next door, Saskatchewan has half the rental housing that Manitoba has. But when I did my research in 2017, it had 70 times more REIT-owned units, 70 times more. And so there is a factor, which I suggest could be related to rent control, that draws these types of firms into jurisdictions where tenants have fewer protections and where it's easier to raise the rents because there's no regulation there. And this is very appealing to firms whose business model is to generate revenues for their investors by raising rents and other fees. And that can be done a lot easier when there's no government regulation. That
is something that our provincial NDP is talking about. We're heading into an election this fall, and they've come out with some ideas of what they would do if they were to become the governing party. And part of that is they're starting to talk about rent control. So you've outlined that it can have an impact if you don't have it. Bringing in something like rent control, how would that help renters who are already maybe in a situation where, well, unfortunately, maybe they've been evicted or they're in an apartment that has seen the rent rise over the years? How might bringing in rent control now help the situation?
I think it would stop the bleeding in a way, in that you would, for going forward, there would be limits on how much landlords could raise rents every year, probably. I mean, in a lot of places where there's rent control, there's annual allowable increases that are typically pegged to inflation in some way or cost of living. And so that prevents these huge increases. Typically, rent can only be, in other places such as Ontario, rent can only be increased once per year. And so this provides some protection and security for tenants living in those places, knowing that the increase they have won't be substantial. And it won't be out of the blue. It'll only happen once a year.
When did we start to see such a drastic change in the rental market? You know, some activists have really pointed to a change dating back to the 90s in Canada. What was happening then?
Yeah, there was a couple things happening. I mean, in my research, I pinpoint that as a starting point where we start to see these shifts. In fact, like the increase in in housing owned by real estate investment trusts started in the mid-90s when those trusts were created in legislation. We also saw some big changes. You had the federal government in Canada getting out of social housing. So the federal government used to fund the production and operation of low-income housing that was targeted to people's rents. So you didn't pay more than 30% of your income each month living in social housing. The federal government cut our social housing programs in Canada in the mid-90s. And so what that meant is that going forward, no more new social housing gets built. Every year, we see a void that has to be filled by the private sector, and the private sector doesn't do that. So big shift there in just government withdrawal from involvement in affordable housing production. We also saw changes in rent control. So going back to what we were just discussing, in the 90s, I think it was in 92 that rent controls were removed in Saskatchewan, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And in other parts of the country, we saw the deregulation of rent controls. In Ontario, where I live, we saw rent control deregulated at that time. And so landlords had this new opportunity to raise rents as soon as a unit became vacant in Ontario. And they previously weren't able to do that. And so what that does is creates this huge incentive to make units vacant. Because if you can raise the rent by any amount once a unit becomes vacant, you're going to want to pursue evictions. You want to pursue displacement, or what in the industry is called unit turnovers, so that you can raise that rent. And that pressure becomes more even extreme when you have a tenant that's been living there for a long time and is paying a lower rent because it's been protected by annual rent controls.
What other solutions are being talked about right now? Rent control being one that you've mentioned already.
I think rent control is a huge one. I mean, the business model of these firms relies on generating revenues through rent increases. If you prevent that from happening, you protect tenants, you increase security of tenure, and you stop that business strategy from working. And I think in what we're really focusing on in Canada is trying to live up to this promise that housing should be a human right. That's something that the government has agreed to in law, and we're not seeing a lot of movement on making that a reality. One of the things you can do to promote the right to housing is ensure that tenants have security of tenure, ensure that tenants have affordable housing, and rent control is one great way to do that. Another great way to do that is by getting back into the business of building social housing. So building housing that is government owned, that is subsidized, and that is affordable for people. You could do more radical things like prevent the ownership of housing by financial firms, by companies that are violating the right to housing, by doing these things like compromising security of tenure. So the government could do this. They have it in their power to do that kind of thing. And we've seen it happen in other places. So there's lots of different things that can be done.
When it comes to building social housing, you mentioned the federal government getting out of that. And I think there's been a lot of pressure on our provincial government, especially coming from the opposition, saying, you know, we need to be thinking more about how we're doing when it comes to social housing. Which level of government do you see as having the most weight when it comes to managing the rental market in the province?
Housing's typically a responsibility of provinces, but then in order to fund that, you really do need support from the federal government as well. It's a social expense, so you need the kind of revenues you get from income tax generation to support that type of redistributive program. So you need the provinces and the federal government to work together on this in terms of funding it and delivering it.
And getting back to financialized landlords, how important is it for us to know about financialized landlords? This may be one of the first times that people have heard this term. How important is it to understand the landscape of our rental market?
I think it's very important. And, it's one of these things, tenants don't often even know who their landlord is. Sometimes these companies own lots and lots of properties, and each one is owned by a different holding company. So 123 numbered company, Saskatchewan, Inc. You might pay your rent to a property management company and not actually know that you're paying it to one of the country's biggest firms, like Boardwalk REIT, very big owner in Saskatchewan, for example.
Martine, we'll leave it there with you, but we're going to continue the conversation. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Martine August is a researcher at the University of Waterloo. I spoke to her earlier. Her research looks into the rise of financialized landlords. I'm Leisha Grabinski. This is Blue Sky. We'd love it if you gave us a call today to share your thoughts on the province's rental market. You could be a renter. We'd like to hear what you're seeing when it comes to rent. You could own a property. You could be a landlord. We'd love to hear from you today. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. The CBC's Liam O'Connor has been looking into how financialized landlords might be contributing to rising rents here in Saskatchewan, and he's been reaching out to renters to learn more about their experience here. Liam is in our Regina studio today. Hello, Liam.
Hi, Alicia.
Why do some housing advocates see financialized landlords as a potential problem here?
Well, the general argument from housing and poverty advocates is that this type of business model often leads landlords to cut costs and raise rents. So unlike mom and pop style landlords who, might have one or two properties, they know their tenants personally, these are massive companies beholden to shareholders, and that means they're looking for return on their investment above all else. So this led me to wanting to know how renters in Saskatoon are doing and seeing if they're being affected by these corporate landlord-owned properties. I spoke with Peter Gilmer from the Anti-Poverty Ministry about this, and he says the rental market in Saskatchewan is out of control, and corporate landlords or financialized landlords are part of the driving force behind that.
The moment that you have private investors, external private investors in the mix, their profit margin obviously becomes a priority factor in terms of the rental market. And so it's not surprising that we've seen increases in rents from that sector, and that, of course, that has a ripple effect across the rental market as a whole.
And again, that's Regina's Anti-Poverty Ministry's Peter Gilmer. And one of his concerns is that we're handing housing over to the private market, and especially to a concentrated ownership. Do
we have a sense of just how many financialized landlords we have, or just like how concentrated is it?
Well, it's a little hard to tell exactly how many there are, but we definitely have an idea. And, a few of the big players in the province, we have Boardwalk, Avenue Living, Main Street, and another one worth mentioning is Widener. Widener Apartment Homes they're a U.S.-based company that owns 70,000 units, and that's including over 6,000 units in Canada. So Main Street has over 18,000 units across Canada. Then Boardwalk, we know from looking at their second quarter report from this year, they have over 3,500 suites in Saskatchewan. And that report also gives us a sense of the kind of money these kinds of corporate landlords can bring in. For the 6-month period this report covers, or it looked at, Boardwalk saw $467 million in profit. Or you can look at Main Street's stock price over the last 2 decades. And in 2000, it was $4.90. In 2023, it was $133.
And then how does that compare with other places?
Well, as we just heard from Martine August, Saskatchewan has half the rental housing that Manitoba has, but when she did her research in 2017, it had 70 times more real estate investment trust units. So her research suggests the weaker rent control rules attract corporate landlords because it's easier to raise rents and is an attractive business model.
We're going to talk more about rent control, and there are different perspectives on that. We'll get to that. But just first, what is rent like in a city like Saskatoon, our biggest city? What's rent like here?
Well, across Canada, rent has increased 22% in the last 2 years. Then when we look at Saskatoon in specific, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment is about $1,200. A 2-bedroom is about $1,500. And according to the rankings on rentals.ca, Saskatoon still has the most affordable rent in Canada, but our rents are increasing year over year more than almost anywhere else in Canada. A 2-bedroom apartment is 18% more than last year. So I spoke with Kevin Casey, who lives in Widener Apartments here in Saskatoon, or where you are in Saskatoon, about the rent increases he's seeing.
With my lease running up here in November, my rent is due to go up to $1,450. So since March 2022, my rent has gone up $395, or ballpark 40%.
And Kevin Casey, he's not alone. I spoke with several other people who have seen substantial rent increases over the past few years.
And just how is that affecting people?
I mean, they're moving. It's as simple as that. They're finding somewhere else to live. Here's Kevin Casey again.
Yeah, I do have something lined up with a friend, which would cut rent down quite a bit. I know his rent is going up, but even with his rent raising, it's going to be equivalent to what I'm paying right now, which is that $1,350, but it's a 2-bedroom versus my 1-bedroom.
Sounds like a stressful situation. Liam, I appreciate the work that you put into this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're hoping to hear from folks today about what you're seeing in the province's rental market. So whether you live in Saskatoon, we focused a lot on that city in Liam's story. Perhaps you live somewhere else and you'd like to share with us the kind of increases that you're seeing, or if you're a landlord. What's your take on this? 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Now, rising rent prices, it's on the minds of many people in this province, but exactly how to deal with it is a point of contention. Our next guests have thought on the future of housing in Saskatchewan. Cam Choquette is with the Saskatchewan Landlords Association, and he's next to me in our Saskatoon studio. Cam, welcome to Blue Sky.
Good afternoon.
So good to have you. And then we also have Mira Conway, who is the housing critic for the NDP. She is in our Regina studio. Mira, welcome back to Blue Sky.
Good to be here, Leisha.
Yeah, okay, so both of you have been listening. Cam, you've been taking notes. I'm taking notes. And I want to unpack with you a number of things that have come up in the conversation so far. First, just in kind of a general way, what is your take on financialized landlords? What's your perspective on it?
Well, we're proud to represent over 800 rent housing providers from across the province who collectively own, operate, and manage over 55,000 rent housing units in the province that houses more than 35% of the province's population. So we're happy to be here representing all of those members. What's important to remember is that this notion of financialization in our world is not as dirty of a word as it's being put out to be by researchers, by advocates, and by tenants. Housing costs money to own and operate. Costs a lot of money to own and operate. And profits generated through housing are primarily used for renovation, retrofit, repair, and reinvestment. And we want to make sure all 4 of those things can be done in rental housing across the province so that the quality and the quantity of housing stock improves and grows over time.
So just as an example, I'm curious, Martine said that a lot of people who rent wouldn't know who their landlord is. So as somebody who represents landlords in Saskatchewan, do you talk to people from Main Street, Widener, some of the companies that were brought up today? Do you speak to them on a regular basis? Do you see them as an individual, or, because they do seem quite large, I think, to the people who are renting?
Certainly, and they are large. Main Street and Widener and Avenue Living and Boardwalk have thousands of rental housing units across the province. They are locally owned and operated in Western Canada for the most part. I understand that Widener's a US-based company. Main Street has a significant holding in Saskatchewan, and they employ local Saskatchewan people day in and day out to manage and operate these properties. So certainly they are big, but we see them as partners in rental housing. They're our members, and they provide an extremely important piece of our economic puzzle here in Saskatchewan, and that being housing. And there are on-site property managers, there are on-site leasing agents that are local employed people. Holding companies certainly do exist, but we have a real benefit in Saskatchewan. Our membership anyways is still quite diverse. To give you an idea, 50% of our members at the association have 4 units or less. So, although Martine, is quoting these 70 times of the REIT ownership, there's still a lot of good mom and pop.
But only half would be mom and pop.
Half of our members have 4 units or less, and then there'd be a good diversity in the other half of our 800 members.
So what do you think is behind the rent increase in Saskatchewan? Martine is saying it has to do with the fact that these large companies, financialized landlords, are taking over a number of our properties. But what do you think has caused more than 20% increase in a year's period from May 2023 to May 2024? What's behind that?
Well, I want to explain that rentals.ca report just a little bit because it's important to distinguish between asking rents and in-place rents. And the data is quite different. So asking rents are only published when a unit becomes vacant and a landlord is now advertising that unit for rent. In-place rents are when you and I just negotiate a lease renewal every year. In-place rental increases in the CMHC report released in January were 8 to 9% across the province, not 21% in-place rent increases. So it's important to just distinguish the two. Rent increases are coming as a result of significant cost increases over the past decade. Because we've had such a healthy vacancy rate in Saskatchewan up until about 2022, latter half 2023, rent increases were at or below inflation for most of my tenure here and for a long time, which means all of the cost increases, property taxes, insurance, mortgage interest, debt service costs, all of those things were being absorbed by the rental housing provider. That becomes untenable in the long term. So what we're seeing is even amidst continued cost increases, we're seeing those rent increases as a result of what we've seen over the past 5 years. Rental housing providers are playing catch up to make up for those costs of owning and operating this rental housing.
I promise I'll come back to you,
certainly,
Cam. I want to bring Mira Conway into the conversation. She is the housing critic for the NDP. Ms. Conway, what's your take on this? Have financialized landlords been on your radar?
Well, I think that with these soaring rent increases we're seeing in Saskatchewan, certainly this research confirmed my sense of things because we hear, we as the housing critic, as an MLA, we hear from people all the time, especially when they're hit with big increases. And to be honest, I know Mr. Choquette is taking issue with that number, but we've heard from people who are getting 30, 40% rent increases. So I'm not at all surprised by that percentage increase. I think, I do think my sense is that large corporate landlords and financialized landlords are behind a lot of these increases. I know, when we made our announcement for maximum increases for protections for renters, I heard from a lot of mom and pop landlords that were shocked to hear that the sky was the limit. They actually didn't even know. So my sense is that these smaller landlords, Mr. Choquette describes it as half of his membership base, are not the driving factor behind these kinds of increases. And, when we look at this, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, increases of 20, 30, 40%. This is madness. We need to return some stabilization and some fairness and some predictability into the rental market. And that's why we've made the commitments that we have.
Okay, and I will ask you more about those commitments. I want to know what is meant by rent increase guidelines. But we've got a number of people who want to get in on the conversation. So let's go to some callers. And I've got a few emails here. So let's start with Craig in Saskatoon, who's on the line right now. Hi, Craig.
Good morning. Or afternoon,
what's your take on this?
Well, I don't know. Like I'm already paying quite a bit for rent here. I had a huge increase there from 2023 to 2024. I had an increase of $160 on my rent. The building that I live in is it's good maintenance-wise, but as far as the hallways and the carpet and that, they're really gross. They allow pets in the building, and the pets pee on their carpet, and then the carpet doesn't get cleaned after that. The walls are really dirty. The doors are dirty. Let's see, what else can I say? And besides that, the owners of the apartments aren't the only ones that are facing cost increases. As tenants, we also have to pay. We have to pay more for our things. Groceries have gone up, utilities have gone up, gas has gone up, and my wage increase at work doesn't really keep up with that.
Sorry to hear that, Craig. I appreciate you calling and sharing, and we're going to put that to both of our guests today just to see what their thoughts are on what you've shared. So, Craig, thanks. That's Craig in Saskatoon. Yeah, so saying $160 increase on a one-bedroom and laying out a few other complaints, which, not the first time that I've heard from someone in Saskatoon who's renting, who's complaining about the state of their apartment building or whatever rental unit that they have. And so, Cam, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I'd have to know the starting rent on what $160 went up from, and the, on a one bedroom, if he's starting at $700 a month, going to $860, he'd still be $200 below market. So that all depends on the starting point and the end point. $160 for anyone is a lot of money at the end of the month, and I certainly understand that rent increases are pinching people. Rent increases are driven by the cost increases that are being borne by the industry on everything from municipal property taxes to utilities.
I can understand that, but then if you're also trying to bring in a profit for your investors, where's that money going?
Yeah, that goes to building more rental housing units in Saskatchewan.
So what's the incentive then to be somebody who wants to invest in an REIT? It must be making you money in some way.
Yeah, the largest real estate investment trust in Canada is a yield of 4% per year.
Okay, Mira, what do you think?
I'm not at all surprised. I mean, Craig's concerns are the concerns of so many people across the province. Number one issue is cost of living, and that's why the Saskatchewan NDP's made a number of affordability commitments around gas, groceries, and here with this promise around rents. Now, I'll just push back a bit because I think that it's not just cost increases that are driving rents, particularly in a jurisdictions like Saskatchewan, which is really an outlier. We have no maximum increase. The sky is the limit. And so when you look at big corporate landlords and if you look at financialized landlords, both have similar incentives in that the driving incentive is profit. I mean, with financialist landlords, you add on to that the return to shareholders. So I want to push back. Certainly there are some increases that are driven by the rising cost of living. We're all feeling that. But it's not the only thing increasing rents in a jurisdiction where we have zero protections against, taking advantage of the lack of regulation in this regard.
Cam, I do want to ask you what the impact might be if there were to be guidelines or so-called rent control here. But I just want to share a couple more emails and calls. So Sylvia writes, I haven't been a renter in Saskatoon since 2017. However, I can attest that it was the Sask Party government under Brad Wall that increased how often rent can be raised in a year. I can't remember the exact year. It was in the early 2000s, but prior to this, rent in this province could be raised once a year, and under Premier Wall, landlords were for a period able to raise rent 4 times a year with no limit on the amount of increase. This was eventually reduced to twice a year, which is where it is now. What I experienced was that landlords would raise the rent to unrealistic levels and risk losing long-term reliable tenants. Once the tenants moved out, landlords were in a position to raise the rent yet again. I had a period in 2008, 2009 when I moved 5 times. In one case, I moved into an apartment and 3 months later received a 100% rent increase. My income had not gone up and I was forced to find somewhere more affordable to live. I can tell you that being a tenant, living with such unpredictability is beyond stressful. It's frightening and immoral on the part of landlords and governments. Cam, I'll have you respond to that, and that will lead us into, as Ms. Conway is saying right now, her sense is the sky is the limit, and so if we brought in some kind of rent control, what would be the impact?
Yes, so good history brought in by that email. Currently, every 6 months, rent can be increased. What we're seeing is a move away from month-to-month tenancies. Most are fixed-term 1-year leases, so we're seeing rent only increase that once a year at lease renewal. It's important to remember that although people are painting a bad picture of the entire rental housing industry, we're in the people business. We're here to make sure people have housing. Evictions are a last resort for all of the good, professional, law-abiding rental housing providers in this province. Sure, there are bad apples that may turn to 100% rental increases to cause an eviction. If that is the case, there's a provision in the legislation that allows tenants to fight that at the Office of Residential Tenancies. But it's important to remember we want to keep people in buildings because good, happy tenants make for good, happy buildings. And it's important to recognize that we're in the housing business, that evictions are a last resort. If rent controls are brought in, I mean, after the NDP's announcement a couple of weeks ago, I met with a number of members. To put it bluntly, their backs were against the wall because it scares away investment. It reduces the quality of the housing stock. In my time here, I've witnessed some excellent professional profit-making rental housing providers put thousands of rental housing units in Saskatchewan. In Saskatoon. Thousands in the last 5 years of my tenure.
And that's part of the issue, is it has been low stock. And so from your perspective, you would want people investing in rental housing here in Saskatchewan.
We need hundreds of
supply.
new rentals a day to keep pace with population growth. Rent control will absolutely crush investment in Saskatchewan. And I've heard it. And we see in other provinces.
Why would it? Help me understand that.
Because if at the end of the day a building receives a 6% increase in costs over the course of 12 months, but the NDP government says you can only raise rent 3%, there's a 3% gap there. That 3% comes in reducing cleaning shifts, reducing carpet cleaning, that comes in reduced maintenance, and over time, that creates uninhabitable rental housing units.
Mayor Conway, I'll have you explain maybe what it is your party is proposing and help me understand the difference in language here. And I'm just going to find it.
Sure.
Because I don't think you use the term rent control. You're calling it rent increase guidelines. So what exactly are you hoping for?
Yeah, and I if I can just say one thing in response to what Mr. Choquette covered, even if this is a couple of bad apples, if you have no limitations, then it opens the system up to abuse. So. If we look at the reality on the ground, there are human beings coming forward saying they're getting 20, 30, 40% rent increases. We've talked to hundreds of them. That is happening, and it shouldn't be happening, especially in a province with the lowest minimum wage, students paying the second highest tuition in Canada. This is not a stable and predictable situation for people. So, I just want to push back on that. And then this idea that it would chill rental starts. The CMHC did a recent report on this, and they actually found, and they say in their report, contrary to expectations based on the literature, they found that jurisdictions where there were maximum increases, that did not lower housing starts. They did not find any evidence of that. And this is CMHC. They have the best data. They have data going back 50 years, and they did a recent study on it. So I don't think there's any evidence.
But do you worry at all about influencing the market, especially at a time when the calls for more housing are just so loud that we so many people have said we need more supply? Do you worry at all that could be an impact?
I think that there is a lot that we need to be doing to increase housing supply. I've read the blueprint put forward by the Saskatchewan Landlords Association with other players, and I agree with much of what's in there. I don't think there's evidence to suggest that this kind of cap on what can be charged would impact that. I don't think there's any evidence for that across Canada. We are an outlier. Saskatchewan is an outlier, and when we have 1% vacancy rates, that opens the system up to abuse. And when you have like larger actors that are mainly profit driven, it opens it up to abuse. That is a fact, and we want to come down on that. Yeah.
I'll let Cami. I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, I'd push back on that CMHC study. We can look at the rentals.ca report. We can see that in jurisdictions where housing starts have not kept pace with population growth, they have the highest rents in the country, the highest by a long shot. We've had the benefit of the market driving supply growth in Saskatchewan for the past decade, and strong multifamily rental housing growth in the past 5 years especially. It's not a coincidence that Saskatoon and Regina are number 33 and 35 on Canada's most affordable cities to rent a home. It will absolutely scare away investment. And what that study fails to consider is the long-term impacts we're seeing in Toronto and Vancouver, where people aren't building because rent control has made projects unfeasible and unviable, which is why they've had 1% vacancy in Ottawa for a decade.
We'll keep talking, but I want to bring in a few more people to the conversation. So we have another caller on the line, Loretta in Saskatoon. Loretta, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hello. I would like to put this to both of your guests. I'm in disagreement about the 3 to 6% dependent upon cost of living products to renovate or so on, units to make up for it. And the reason is this: profitability or the financialization of housing is dependent upon a disproportionate download of responsibility to the least resourced. This requires an artificial surplus and to manufacture scarcity. So that percentage that was quoted that it takes to make the units better and the absorption that is therefore required by the least resourced, that's the problem. The profit currently can absorb the difference. It's being downloaded onto the least resourced. Those are those in social housing. Those are those with low income or no income. Those are those in our province, our neighbors, our fellow people in Saskatchewan, that we're asking to pay a higher percentage and a disproportionate responsibility. So I'd like that to be spoken to.
Okay. Loretta, thank you for calling. Mira Conway, I'll let you respond first.
I hope I understood the question. I think maybe pointing out that even there's no guarantee that some of these profits will be put back into maintaining some of these units. And then the caller spoke about manufactured scarcity. I do want to just speak to that for a moment, because one of the commitments that we've made as a party is to get the social housing units that are currently sitting vacant across the province back up and online. Because right now we have about 3,000 of them. And I know here in Regina, that's about a 25% vacancy rate in a city that has about a 1% vacancy rate. So even just with our, we think that investing in the current housing stock is a first start, getting many of those units back online, opening up some of them to affordable housing rather than just social housing. We think that will help ease some of the sort of tension here with these low vacancy rates. I hope I touched on what the caller was trying to get at.
And it's interesting, Cam, because you're nodding, and I know you two talk all the time. You've got a great relationship. But is that something that you agree on? Like how important is the social housing piece of this whole puzzle?
Proud to support the investment, renovation, retrofit, building new social and affordable housing. Proud to support the federal government's rental protection fund in helping nonprofits, cooperative housing providers scoop up some of these buildings that mom and pops are selling. We're in strong support of that because we believe that a housing continuum serviced by a variety of players, delivering various types of housing, social, affordable, cooperative, market rate, meets the needs of Saskatchewan people. We're all better together, and we're proud to support the NDP's, and potential investments in Sask housing because social housing and affordable housing is a piece of that continuum that we absolutely need more of.
Okay, our next caller, I think, has something to add to this conversation. So Dwight joins us right now in Prince Albert. Hi, Dwight. What do you want to bring up today?
Well, the reason I was calling in was I had heard no comment made about cooperative housing, not-for-profit housing development to build a better piece into the marketplace in terms of affordable housing. So it's funny that it's just come up while I'm waiting to get on the line here. But I know in Prince Albert, where I'm from, our Métis Housing organization is, I think, doing a pretty good job of building an inventory of affordable housing. In terms of cooperative housing development and that kind of thing, I'm not that sure. But to me, that's, if I've been a business guy, and I know in business you've got to show some kind of a return on investment and that type of thing. But if you're a not-for-profit or a cooperative or that kind of thing, then that becomes, it's more of, can we cover our costs? Can we build in enough for reasonable maintenance and repair and building our inventory and that type of thing? So I don't know what the government can do to maybe encourage more of that kind of organization to build our inventory at an affordable rental rate. I don't know if you have any comments. Mine was more of a question than a great idea about what we can do. Any answers along those lines?
Yeah, great questions. Mira Conway, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think the cooperative housing model is a wonderful model. It's one that's had a lot of success in Saskatchewan and across the country. And I share actually the caller's frustration that we don't talk about this more. The ones that exist are very successful. The Saskatchewan NDP has a proud history of cooperatives. I did meet, a few months ago with the head of the cooperative, one of the cooperative groups out of one of the national groups. I've met locally with the provincial representatives. I think this is definitely a path that we need to pursue. And it hasn't kind of made the short list of our election platform, but it's been work that I've been engaging in as a critic, and I have no qualms saying that this is a good model that we need to look to solve many of the housing challenges ahead.
Anything quick to add?
I would just say, we represent a number of not-for-profit housing providers at the association level, and what we're seeing on affordable housing developments, or new or existing, is they're coming with a pile of subsidy, non-repayable loans, grants, because that housing still costs money to operate. But absolutely, if it adds supply to the continuum, we need to invest in it and welcome it. Okay.
We didn't get to everybody who tried to call in and share emails, but you can always call our talkback, 1-800-661-7540, if I'm remembering correctly. And I just wanted to clarify something. Craig, one of our first callers, did call back because he wanted to point out that his rent, so he's the one who talked about the $160 increase. So he went from $1,145 for I think it went from $1,305 up to $1,000. No, I'm sorry. I'm $1,145 for a one-bedroom to $1,305, and he's saying that is half his paycheck. So just wanted to share that Craig called with that information. This has been great. I've learned a lot from all of you, so thank you so much, Cam, for being here.
My pleasure.
Mira Conway, thank you to you too.
Always a pleasure, Alicia. Thank you.
Mira Conway is the NDP's housing critic. Cam Choquette is with the I'm having trouble today. It's a Monday. Saskatchewan Landlords Association. I am Leisha Gervinsky. You've been listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. We always post our shows on demand for you to listen on the CBC Listen app and on YouTube too. You can search for our CBC Saskatchewan page.